Say this sentence in your head, right now, in your own voice. What time is it? Did you actually hear something? An actual voice, forming actual words, moving through your mind the way a sentence spoken out loud would sound? Or did something else happen instead? A flicker of the concept without any words attached to it? Maybe a picture of a clock? Or just the kind of instant knowing with nothing you could really call language involved at all? Whatever just happened in your head, you've probably spent your entire life assuming it happens the exact same way inside everyone else's head too. And that assumption turns out to be far shakier than almost anyone realizes until they actually look into it. A psychologist named Russell Hurlburt has spent years trying to answer a question that sounds almost too simple to need answering, which is, what is actually happening inside a person's head at any given moment? Not what they think is happening in general, but what's genuinely there in one specific instant. His method, called descriptive experience sampling, involves giving someone a small device that beeps at random points throughout the day, and the moment it beeps, they write down exactly what was passing through their mind the instant before the sound interrupted them. Not a summary of their general mental style, the actual specific content of that one exact moment. What this method kept turning up, sample after sample, across thousands of people over years of research, is that inner speech, the experience of actually hearing words in your head, is far less constant and far less universal than everyone assumes going in. Some people's samples come back full of it almost every single time, a running verbal narration accompanying nearly everything they do. Other people go through entire stretches of sampled moments with no words at all, describing instead a feeling, a physical sensation, a burst of pure, unworded understanding, or a vivid image doing the work that a sentence would do for someone else entirely. This became a much bigger public conversation a few years ago when it spread widely online, with people genuinely shocked to discover that friends and family members experienced their own thinking in a completely different format than they did, sometimes after decades of never once talking about it. Because why would you, since you'd never had a reason to suspect your own head worked differently from anyone else's? Hurlburt and psychologist Christopher Heavey studied thousands of moments and noticed that the same few patterns kept coming up. Inner speaking, the words in your head experience most people assume is universal. Inner seeing, thinking that happens primarily through mental images rather than language. Feeling, an emotional experience present in the moment without necessarily being attached to any specific thought at all. Sensory awareness, simply and directly noticing something physical, a texture, a sound, a temperature, without any commentary layered on top of it. And unsymbolized thinking, which is the one that tends to confuse people the most when they first hear about it. A genuine thought, complete and specific, that arrives with no words and no image attached to it whatsoever, just a direct, wordless knowing of something. Almost nobody lives entirely in just one of these modes. Most people move between several of them constantly throughout a single day, but the balance between them, which one shows up most often, which one barely shows up at all, varies enormously from person to person, and that variation is largely invisible because you only ever have direct access to your own inner experience and have to simply assume everyone else's matches it closely enough not to matter. So the question is, where the voice in your head actually came from? Decades before this kind of modern research existed, developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky came up with an idea that still makes a lot of sense today. It also helps explain why inner speech exists in the first place, especially for people who experience it a lot. He observed that young children talk to themselves constantly out loud while playing, narrating what they're doing, working through problems by literally speaking the steps aloud to no one in particular. This isn't a random thing. It's a genuine tool the developing mind is using to regulate itself, to plan, to slow down and think through a sequence. Vygotsky's argument was that this external spoken self-talk doesn't just disappear as children grow older. It goes underground, gradually becoming quieter and more compressed until it turns into what we experience as the internal voice, if we end up being someone who develops one in that particular form. This origin story matters because it reframes the inner voice as something learned and built through a specific developmental process, rather than some fixed, universal feature every human brain automatically comes installed with, which also helps explain why the format it takes, verbal for some people, largely image-based or wordless for others, would end up varying so much depending on how that early developmental process unfolded for each individual. Now, the next question is, whose voice is it, and what tone is it using? For people who do experience a strong verbal inner monologue, there's another layer of variation to understand, which is whose voice it actually sounds like, and what tone it consistently takes. Some people describe their inner voice as neutral, almost mechanical. Others describe it as sounding distinctly like a specific person from their life, sometimes a parent, sometimes an old teacher, carrying that person's exact cadence and their exact way of delivering criticism or encouragement, decades after any direct contact with that person may have ended. The psychologist Ethan Kross has done research specifically on how the grammatical structure of your inner speech changes its actual effect on you. His studies found that people who talk to themselves using their own name or the word you rather than I during stress or difficulty perform measurably better and experience less anxiety than people using first-person language for the same internal talk. Something as small as the pronoun your inner voice defaults to appears to create real psychological distance, letting you coach yourself the way you'd coach someone you cared about, rather than being fused directly with the panic or self-criticism in the moment. This suggests the inner voice isn't just a passive narrator reporting on your mental state, it's actively shaping how you experience whatever's happening to you, which means two people going through the identical external situation could be having genuinely different internal experiences of it, based purely on the linguistic habits of the voice running inside. Now, let me tell you something very interesting. It's rarely full sentences, even for people who have it constantly. The psychologist Charles Fernyhough, who has spent much of his career studying inner speech specifically, found something that surprises most people who do have a strong verbal inner monologue, which is that it's usually far more compressed and fragmented than they assume when they're not paying close attention to it. Real inner speech, when researchers actually manage to capture it accurately in the moment, rather than relying on someone's memory of it afterward, tends to be clipped, abbreviated, missing words, jumping between fragments rather than running as complete, grammatically clean sentences the way we tend to imagine it does. It's less like having a voice in your head talking non-stop, and more like a kind of mental shorthand. Sometimes it's words, but it can also mix with images, emotions, or physical sensations. This matters because a lot of people, when first asked to describe their inner voice, actually describe an idealized, cleaned-up version of it, rather than what's genuinely happening, simply because attention itself changes the experience the moment you turn it toward examining it closely. Now, this is really important to understand, and also, it's very interesting. Different people are genuinely running on different operating systems. There's a related and increasingly discussed phenomenon called aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily generate mental images at all, which sits alongside inner speech as another axis along which people's internal experience diverges sharply. Someone with aphantasia asked to picture a beach might report nothing visual whatsoever, just an abstract conceptual knowledge of beach-related facts, while someone without it genuinely sees something resembling an image when asked the same question. These two variations, verbal versus wordless thinking and visual versus non-visual thinking, don't always overlap the way you'd expect, meaning a person could have vivid mental imagery and almost no inner speech, or constant inner speech and almost no imagery, or any combination in between, which means the actual felt experience of thinking is far more individually varied than the phrase inner monologue, treated as a single universal thing, really captures. Now, you might ask why this actually matters beyond being an interesting fact. Once you take this seriously, it changes some fairly practical things. Meditation instructions that assume everyone is trying to quiet a constant verbal narrator make far less sense for someone whose baseline experience barely includes one to begin with. Advice to talk yourself through a hard moment assumes a format of thinking that isn't universally available in the same way to everyone receiving that advice. Even ordinary empathy gets slightly more complicated. Once you accept that the person next to you might be experiencing their own thoughts in a format you've never personally had access to, meaning their account of what a decision or a feeling was like for them isn't just a difference in personality. It might be a genuinely different mode of cognition producing that account in the first place. It's worth actually paying attention to your own inner experience over the next few days, not to judge it against some assumed standard, but simply to notice what's genuinely there when you catch it. Words, images, a wordless flash of understanding, a feeling with nothing attached to it at all. Whatever you find, it's been running quietly in the background of every decision you've ever made, and most people go through their entire life never once turning around to actually look at it directly. That's it for today. I'd genuinely like to know what you found when you actually checked. So tell me in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.